All right, so moving on in Steiner's Egyptian Myths and Mysteries, we're up to Lecture 5, The Genesis of the Trinity of Sun, Moon, and Earth, and Osiris and Typhon. This lecture was given September 7th, 1908 in Leipzig, and this is one of my favorite chapters. This is where Steiner returns back to his creation myth. I love his creation myths. They're so much fun. He gives a lot more interesting details here that he doesn't give the following year when he writes Outline of Esoteric Science. In this version, what he does is he talks about the Earth. He specifically wants to talk about the Earth phase. We've had Saturn, Sun, Old Moon, and then now we're in the Earth phase. But the thing with each one of these phases is that there's a darkening, a pralaya at the end of each phase. So each one of them is punctuated by a darkening in which everything goes back into the darkness and then comes out again and recapitulates the previous stages that go before it. And though Steiner doesn't say that in this lecture, I'm pretty sure that's what he's talking about here, because he goes back to discuss the origin of his three-body system, where you have Sun separated from Earth, Earth plus Moon, and then Moon separated from it. So you end up with a trinity of three separate bodies. And I think that all of that is a recapitulation as he goes through the stages to get to that of Saturn, Sun, and Moon. He says, okay, so imagine that in the beginning there's this primeval mist, and within this primeval mist, once again, we have these little germs of light, these little light particles, light beings, and then at a certain point, this mist vapor that's swirling around lights up, and a primitive sun begins to light it up. And he says that the thing about this light, and he also says that the thing that materialists miss about the sun is that the sun has spiritual beings within it. To this day it does, has spiritual beings within it, and that the sunlight that falls upon the earth is not just sunlight, as you will find in science textbooks, let's say, but it's light perfused with love, so that it's love from these cosmic beings pouring this love radiance down upon the earth, so that love is part of what is in this light. And these beings that then come into being, the early human forms, and this whole thing is pregnant with the germs of animals, plants, and minerals that have not been awakened, but only the human light forms have been awakened. And they're like these, you have the shapes of these little sort of gaseous cloud formations swimming around in this primordial ether with light and luminosity shining through them. And they're just swimming around doing things, who knows what, swimming around enjoying the light, I guess. And they're in a mixture that's woven in with the cosmic hierarchies, Steiner's angels, who are intermixed with them. And so the whole thing is mixed in together. And then gradually what happens is that the mist begins to densify a bit, and then eventually the sun slowly withdraws from this mass, and all these higher beings go with it, except for one being who remains behind on this Earth plus Moon system, that we'll later find out is Yahweh. And we'll also later find out that when the moon leaves, he'll go with the moon. But at this point, he's the only one of these higher beings who wishes to stay behind and sort of supervise the evolution of these new beings, these human creature things now that are densifying and changing shape. Once the sun leaves, then the air, that is actually not just air, it's a thick vapor, condenses and densifies into water, and so we get this watery giant surrounded by this mist, this very thick vapor that becomes more and more refined the further out into space it gets. And within this water ball are these new humans who are swimming around, who miss the light. They're upset that the sun has left and it's leaving, because they're depressed now because they missed the light. Although what happens is that the human form is this weird sort of plant-like creature that's sort of like a cross between a plant and an animal, and it divides into two halves, an upper half and a lower half, and only the lower half swims around in the water, but the upper half remains in this sort of gaseous vapor plant-like state. It's like a weird plant shape. He says it's kind of like a chalice shape in a way, that's like a plant, maybe like one of those little creatures called a medusa, something like that, that's got a plant-like shape. And the light, as the sun is withdrawing, the light still is able to get through the vapor, the dense vapor atmosphere, and shine on the upper half of man. So that his upper half doesn't go into the water, but the lower half becomes this kind of fish-like amphibian half, because within the water resounds something which he says is called tone. So there is tone resounding through the water that gives the water its form and begins to work on the lower aspect of the human element and shapes it into this half amphibian-like creature, half gaseous plant creature, half amphibian creature. That's a little bit like the book, the New Age book, The Hidden Messages in Water, by the Japanese guy, what's his name, Masaru Emoto, where he talks about how you can send tones through water, like put a vessel of water in between speakers and pour classical music through the speakers, and you can study what forms in the water under a microscope is actually these mandala-like, very intricate, beautifully formed crystals that originate in the water as the result of the tones of the classical music going through the water. And so it's something like that. And I've said this before, that there's nothing in the New Age, whether from Deepak Chopra down to Eckhart Tolle or this guy, that wasn't already somewhere in Steiner. This idea that tone going through water creates form. Oh, another one of the Japanese guy's points was that negative energy going through the water, like aggression, like an angry voice going through the water, will produce deformed mandalas. It will produce crystals that when you examine them under a microscope are asymmetric, ugly, and deformed. And 70% of the earth is water, and most of our bodies are made up of water. So that's an interesting fact, that when you're, like, for example, when you're listening to classical music, a lot of people like to study with classical music. This is called the Mozart Effect. It's very well known. Listening to classical music harmonizes the forebrain in such a way that it increases cognitive coherence. But from Masaru's studies, it sounds like that it also creates coherence in your blood, actually in your actual blood, that it creates these little mandala crystals. There's a reason why you have a sense of well-being when you're listening to classical music. So anyhow, this is Steiner's point, that tone is going through the water, and it's giving water its shape and its form, as well as forming this lower fish-like aspect to these half fish, half gaseous vapor, light-filled upper halves of these creatures. And so there are baser elements within the water. He says only the lowest astral elements, the ugly ones, are working through the water onto this creature, onto these human creatures. And he says that the tone is actually coming from Yahweh. He says Yahweh is the only being from the withdrawal of the sun who has remained behind, and he is sending these tones through the water, perhaps as a means of compensation for the withdrawal of the light as the sun is leaving, although still working on the upper half of the human form. But then gradually, and he says today's fishes are just degenerate echoes of this original amphibial type human form. I guess we could imagine a creature like the Babylonian god Oannes, who's sort of half fish, half man. Creatures like that, and I think that's probably what Steiner had in mind as he was sort of tuning all of this in. So the sun has left, and then water has formed, although it should be pointed out that the causal sequence there is a little bit different from what he says in the following year when he writes Outline of Esoteric Science, and he says that the whole reason that the sun withdrew from the earth was because air was densifying into water, and water was becoming too dense for the higher spiritual beings to work with, and they couldn't work with it anymore because it was just too dense. They could only deal with warmth and air, so therefore the sun left. Here the causal sequence is not the same. Water doesn't form until the sun withdraws. Then water forms, and we get this watery earth. So all of this is going on, and then gradually at the core of the earth, it's densifying, so that the core of the earth is now condensing and solidifying into actual solids. So we get a solid core forming with the earliest minerals that are coming into being. And these human creatures, the top half of them gradually metamorphoses or devolves, I suppose, into this monstrous dragon-like creature. This is like something out of an H.P. Lovecraft story. this monstrous dragon-like creature, and he says this is the origin of where we get dragons from. Our dragons in our myths are memories of this, and the struggle between the light half of the human and the lower base half is personified in dragon slayer myths, like St. Michael, for instance, slaying the dragon in the Book of Revelation, or St. George. This is the primordial struggle of the upper light-filled half of the human being that was basking in the love and light coming from the sun with maximum coherence, I suppose you could say, and then the lower half that resorts to the lower, sort of below the belt, lower chakras of the human animal nature. So then some of these creatures form into this, what he'll call at the end of the chapter, Typhon. Typhon is the monster that Zeus fought, that's human above and has serpent legs below. So then these creatures form, and then the human beings slowly are changing their shapes, and we get the solidification and densification at the core of the earth, and gradually now the moon needs to withdraw. So the moon, there's a cosmic catastrophe, and the moon withdraws. And he says here the causal sequence is again reversed, because the solidification, he says, doesn't happen until the process of the withdrawal of the moon. Whereas an outline of esoteric science, he says that the reason the moon withdrew was because the earth was solidifying, water was solidifying and condensing into solids, and the solids were forming bodies that were not pliable enough when souls returned and re-inhabited them from their day sojourn with the sun and their night adventures going back into the body. The bodies were too stiff for these souls to work with, so the moon had to withdraw and take the earth's hardening, stiffening, calcifying forces with it, the surplus of mineralogical forces that it took with it as it left and withdrew. Here the causal sequence is a little different. He says that the moon withdraws first, then the solidification process takes place. But either way, these are minor details. They're not a big deal. These are the morphological structure of the sequences is still the same. We still have these human beings who originally were soaking up the light. And so now with the withdrawal of the moon, the vapor that has been surrounding the earth slowly thins out. It begins to thin out so that the sun can get through it, but it continues to thin, and then it turns into air, he says. And so now the human being can do something new that it hasn't been able to do before, which is to breathe the air now. So now the human being is actually able to breathe the air and to recognize that which it was taking in before as light, now it is taking in as air into lungs that can breathe this air. It's interesting that he doesn't say oxygen. He specifically sticks with the four elements of the classics, earth, air, fire, and water, so that there's breathing going on. And he says at the same time that these beings are learning how to breathe, death comes in. So now they have to go through the process of dying. But whereas before, when there were just these light beings, the upper half of them were just these light beings, they felt themselves as immortal, and that they didn't die. They weren't born and died, but they were like immortal. But now with breathing, mortality comes in, death comes in. This is a little interesting because in a way it does sort of tap a bit what William Irma Thompson used to talk about. He was a big fan of Rudolf Steiner, and he used to talk about Rudolf Steiner in his books. And I think it was in Coming Into Being where he said, sounds a little bit like Steiner remembering the earliest bacteria that emerged about 2 billion years ago, where we have the first generation is methanogenic bacteria that live in the thermal vents deep in the ocean, and they expel methane, which creates methane's a big greenhouse gas, which creates a greenhouse dome, but also eventually carbon dioxide, which of course stains the sky like the color of the skies of Mars, carbon dioxide. And so, but these, the next generation of bacteria, blue-green cyanobacteria, invent photosynthesis, and they use the energy that's in sunlight to cleave CO2 molecules. They want the carbon to eat it, basically, to use it for their bodies, and they clip off the oxygen molecules, which then go up into the atmosphere. And pretty soon there's an oxygenated atmosphere that creates an oxygen catastrophe, turns the sky blue from red to blue, but it creates a catastrophe because it's a poison. Oxygen's a poison. It kills things that aren't built to respire it. So you get another generation of bacteria that are aerobic. These are anoxic bacteria, these blue-green cyanobacteria who invent photosynthesis. Then you get aerobic bacteria who now can handle the oxygen and respire it, and they're very aggressive about puncturing into other bacteria and gobbling them up. And so Lynn Margulis came up with the theory of cellular symbiosis, where these two types of bacteria later are taken up into larger cells from these processes of other cells gobbling cells that they can't digest perhaps, and which become a permanent part of their architecture. This is now textbook science. This theory, when she first began to espouse it in the 60s and 70s, was regarded as fringe science. Now it's official. It's textbook science. It's pretty well agreed that our cells, plant cells, have chloroplasts. These original cyanobacteria were taken up into larger cells to take a permanent home in there as chloroplasts, which give plants their ability to photosynthesize, whereas these other aerobic bacteria have been taken up inside of animal cells to become mitochondria, which give them their ability to handle oxygen. So it's a little interesting that Steiner's cosmology, as Thompson points out, and I think he may have a good point here, that somehow Steiner is tuning into this early Archean or Proterozoic epoch of the Earth in which life is invented by these bacteria who also don't die. That's the other point that's similar with Steiner's idea that these light bacteria felt immortal until they had to start breathing. Bacteria don't die. They're the only organisms that are alive that don't have to die. They don't have aging built into them, and they reproduce asexually through splitting. They just split. One parent splits into two daughter cells, and they split. But they don't have to die, except through natural causes. But they don't have aging built into them. Not till you have death do you have sex, which is an invention later of the protists, which are multicellular organisms like a euglena that has a flagellum tail that skips around in the water, and it has chloroplasts built into it and a nucleated cell. It's a whole larger organism that now has both sex and death. These things have to die. If you have to die, now you have to reproduce sexually, so that comes in. So it's really interesting. And then he says, too, Steiner makes this other point that these organisms they didn't have bones at first. First, they floated around in that gaseous atmosphere. Then when water came, the lower half of them dunked down into the water while the upper half still floated around in the cloud mist vapor with sunlight, and then was transformed into these other creatures, these typhonic creatures. And then eventually when this process happened, they formed bones. Along with breathing, they actually formed bones, which in a way reminds me of another epoch, a much later epoch than the Proterozoic, which is like 2.5 billion years ago, is the Cambrian explosion, 575 million years ago, when all of a sudden all these multicellular creatures appear. Almost all of them can fit in the palm of your hand, except for one monster, a 3-foot-long creature called Anomalocaris, which was the predator, the Tyrannosaurus rex of this age that gobbled trilobites like candy. During this period, none of these creatures had bones, although they did have a number of them. The arthropods are already there, and they already have exoskeletons, like trilobites do, and Anomalocaris. They already have exoskeletons. And some of them have teeth. They're stripping minerals like calcium phosphate and transforming them into serrated edges for teeth. So sometimes you get weird worms that have toothed mouths for chomping up other organisms, but none of them really have bones, although we do have the first fish here. And it's clear that during this epoch, fish have evolved from worms. Worms somehow at some point flattened. They flattened and turned sideways, so that they flattened horizontally and turned sideways so they could swim through the water. If you look at the earliest fish, they're clearly transformed worms, and they don't have bones, but they do have a primitive notochord in place of a spine. And some of the species have cartilaginous skulls made out of cartilage, but no bones. And I don't think that bones come in, especially endoskeletons rather than exoskeletons, until the next epoch, the Ordovician. I believe that's when fish begin to develop bones on their interior. So I don't know. Somehow Steiner is tuning into these early epochs of the Earth and doing it clairvoyantly, it's like a dream version of our scientific creation myth. I've written a poetic epic called Archai, a poetic history of the Earth, where I've done a poetic version of each of these epochs, sticking very closely with the realism, though, of what our current scientific theories about these epochs say went on. So it's not a fantasial version of it. But nonetheless, Steiner's version almost reads like a dream version, a dreamlike version of what our scientific theories now say about these separate geological epochs and the transformations of the flora and fauna within them. Finally, he comes to this last point, which isn't tenable, where he says that Osiris and Typhon, apparently initially it was thought by anthropologists that Set was identified with Typhon and was called Typhon. Set is Osiris's brother who kills him and chops his body up into pieces so that he can't be revived again. And then Isis, his sister wife, goes and picks up all the pieces in a basket and puts them back together again and shines light upon him with the eye of Horus that revivifies him. And so it was originally also thought by mistake, you find this in Fraser's Golden Bough, that Osiris was a sun god. He absolutely was not a sun god. That somehow, I don't know where that came from, but it was a huge mistake, and it was perpetuated by James Fraser. Osiris is a moon god. Re is the sun god. Re travels down to the underworld beneath the earth to meet Osiris, specifically to be regenerated so that he can be reborn again as the scarab beetle on the eastern horizon the next morning. Osiris has nothing to do with the sun. He's a moon god, which is why he's torn into 14 pieces, specifically 14, which is half of a lunar cycle, and why Osiris puts them back together again, gathering the pieces as the moon puts itself back together again over the course of the next following 2 weeks to become full again. So Osiris was a moon god. So he says that light and breath were like these two brothers, Osiris, light, and the breath. Typhon somehow has to do with the breath. I'm not sure what his connection is. But this doesn't work. This attempt to connect Steiner's creation myth with Osiris and Typhon / Set does not work. I'm sorry, but it doesn't. Nonetheless, everything else I think is cool. It reads almost like something out of Tolkien's Silmarillion or something out of the monsters remind me of like Dagon out of a Lovecraft story. And I think the chapter is a lot of fun otherwise. So we'll leave it there with that chapter.